Well, it's time again for another tutorial. This is kind of the prequel to our recent skin cast silicone tutorial covering the use of deadener in conjunction with the skin cast silicone. So in this tutorial, we're going to be covering the process of the life cast leading up to the simulator, and then some tips on casting from that to create a reusable mold for a medical simulator or what have you. Now, we've had a lot of interest in this. A lot of you have called me asking for exactly this tutorial, so I figured it was time. There's been a lot of interest with people having mastectomies and things like that, doing these partial casts and then creating lifelike silicone copies. So again, we'll start off with the life cast and then cover some brief tips for casting the silicone. And again, this is kind of a prequel to our previous skin cast tutorials. So at the end of this tutorial, I'm going to link to those so you can be sure to check those out. And I'm going to go ahead and say this at the beginning of the video as well as the end, but be sure to check the video description for our links to our video library section, because we have much more involved tutorials embedded in our video library than some of the material on YouTube. And it's much better organized. So be sure to click on those links and check that out. Now, we've got with us Dani for this particular tutorial, and you might remember from Dani from previous episodes, and she is going to be so kind as to be posing today, and we're going to have her put her arm here for stability. And the main thing, this is a very simple life cast, very low impact on the model. And one of the reasons we're going to be doing this with the new skin cast silicone is the skin cast is self-releasing from skin. So we could even take a handful of this and smear it on Dani's shirt, and for the most part that's going to peel right off because it has no adhesive properties to anything but itself. So typically when we're doing a life cast with more involved silicone life casts, we use either our alginate release or Vaseline, which are excellent releases, but that does require some cleanup. And when you're dealing with talent or people who, again, want to get in and out of the cast quickly, then this minimizes that cleanup. And you have the added benefit of even short hair, even my beard to an extent of half-inch hair or so, typically will release. It does take some work pulling that out, but this does release from fine hair. And people, a lot of times when you're new to silicone life casting, that's one of those things you don't realize that models have very fine hair all over them, and you typically need to take that into consideration. So with the CopyCat, that gets us around that. So for our cast today, now Dani is an experienced model. She's done this for us before. She knows the drill, but always a good idea to have good communication with your model so they know exactly what you expect from them, the pose. You always want to check that out ahead of time so that halfway into the cast or while you're mixing up something and time is critical, you're not trying to give new directions or something. So we want to make sure we have that, even though it's a simple pose. Dani's just going to have her hand here and just in a relaxed pose, and we're just molding this much of her here. So we're very simple cast, very simple area for that. And one of the nice things about doing torso casts and body casting is Dani can talk to us the whole time. So if at any time she's like, hey, if you're dealing with a model that's new to the process, you can be communicating that to them and they can be asking questions within reason. Obviously you don't want them bobbing their head, moving too much, but within reason, a lot more communication is possible with a body cast than with a full head cast or face cast, obviously. So, with that in mind, one more little bit of housekeeping before we proceed. One thing you want to be really mindful of, not especially critical on this particular cast, but you do want to be aware of this, is the CopyCat silicone picks up excellent detail, way better detail than you probably expect it to. But that means it's going to catch things like elastic lines from undergarments. So be aware of that. If you've got elastic areas, if you've got tight clothing, elastic bands and things like that, you want to have your model remove those early enough that their skin can relax and those marks can go away, because the silicone will capture all of that. And typically that's not an issue depending on what the cast is for. A lot of times that doesn't matter, but it does make for, it will leave obvious marks on the cast if you're not careful. Okay, so with the CopyCat silicone, I like to mix this up with a little bit, about 10% silicone fluid. And the reason for that is as it comes, it tends to be more of a thick paste consistency. And for some applications, that's great. And some that tends to be a little too thick. So you can adjust that according to your needs. I've added up to like 20% silicone fluid. But because of that, we're going to mix that in first. And if this takes, I've got multiple batches ready to go off camera, but it's a good idea to have several batches that you can stagger because this will bond really well to itself, but you want to make sure that you've got those within arm's reach, and you can always save those for another cast if you don't use them right away. But what I'm doing here is just mixing that silicone fluid into that base rubber. And our working time with this is about 5 minutes at room temperature with about a 15-minute demold time with, again, with room temperature. Now, one of the nice things about the contrasting colors there is we can tell when we have a good, thorough mix. And because that is fairly thick, I like to use 2 stir sticks to really get that mixed up. And also transfer that back and forth between the 2 mixing buckets. And that just ensures that we get all of that incorporated in that mix. If you just scoop these out and move them to another bucket, not a big deal, but that can throw you off ratio. If you're working in really small batches, that can get you off ratio. So something to be aware of. Dani, are you all set?
Yeah.
Okay. Now there's the consistency that we have here.
It's a very nice consistency.
Thank you. Okay, so again, our consistency, what I'm going for here is the consistency of traditional alginate. That's a little bit on the drippy side because I don't want this to run. I want it to run a little bit, but not just go all over the place. And we want it to be just maneuverable enough or just runny enough that we can capture really good detail. Now again, the area that we're doing for our cast is just right up here to her collarbone and right down the side. And just right over to her sternum. And the reason I'm doing this just one at a time here, we're just doing this one, is if you're doing this for like a mastectomy or breast model, it's a lot handier to have them separate for casting than it is to have them together. You'll see that in the casting stage, that's going to make a lot more sense. And again, the nice thing, because this is self-releasing, whatever this drips on, if it gets on her feet or shoes, that typically removes fairly easily, but always be aware that there's always going to be some fabric or something somewhere that it might stick to and stick more tenaciously than others. So when in doubt, do a test if you're concerned about that.
I've never had any problems with it.
So one of the things you want to be careful about, as Dani just brought up again, this releases so well that for a larger torso cast, especially when that weight starts to build up and the cast has been on a little bit, taking a deep breath, it can actually release and start to just fall off. So you want to be aware of that and be ready for that. So Dani, thankfully, is well aware of that and will signal me accordingly if that becomes an issue. Now, just like with a traditional alginate cast or some of our Gel 25 life casts, we're going to reinforce this with plaster bandages. And these bandages, I've layered 3 layers thick, and that allows me to just dip this once into the water and apply it. And one of the things I'm a real stickler for with this kind of cast is I don't like to ever have that rough edge exposed anywhere on the cast. So when I dip this in the water, I fold that edge back, and that gives us a nice clean edge to work with. And not a big deal, but it's one of those little housekeeping tips that just makes a nice cleaner cast to use later on. The other thing is you always want to make sure with your bandage water that you have nice, clean, warm bandage water. And these are our extra fast set bandages, the only bandages on our website, so you can't accidentally get slow bandages. But that's real important. The speed of these and the quality is really important, because using slow bandages, it'll take them forever, and then of course your model will not be happy if they have to stand around a long time waiting for those bandages to solidify. And again, if your silicone has already set, is starting to come off, that can become problematic. So anyway, we're going to get moving with the bandages now. We're going to start from the top and work down. And the main area that I need for this cast to actually build our medical model is right in here. So I don't have to go outside that too much. That's good for Dani, because that means she doesn't have to have bandage material on her just raw skin or exposed skin. Now, the other thing I'm doing is overlapping. Each bandage is overlapping the previous by about halfway. So each one is going about halfway over that previous bandage. And what that does is that makes sure we have a really good, strong shell. If they just barely touch, you don't have near the strength as having about halfway over each previous bandage. The other thing that you'll notice here is by working down, by working from the top down, that allows any runoff. If you have any extra, excess water coming off your bandage material, it's dripping away from your work area. One of the things that can compromise the strength of your plaster bandages is if you're putting on the bandages and you start here and you work up and back down and around, you can wind up with bandages that are oversaturated and they are really soggy and they don't get to full strength. Now the same thing on the sides of the cast. We're going to do that folded edge to make sure we get a really good strong edge there. And this is where we want to take care to make sure that we're pressing that into any undercut areas, because you don't want to create an air pocket between the silicone cast and that bandage cast. If you create an air pocket later on, that could shift around and create distortions in your cast. Okay, so again, we're at the tail end of the cast down at the bottom, so we're going to put this one right across here and just define that edge. Okay, so there's our final bandage. And again, you want to make sure you're moving in a timely fashion. One of the things that I'm taking probably a little longer than I normally would on this cast, just because it's I'm explaining some of my actions as I go, but you want to make sure anytime you're doing a body cast, especially when you have a standing pose like this, even a simple pose, you want to get your model in the cast and out of the cast as quick as you can, because the longer they're in the cast, the more chance you have of somebody locking their knees or getting destabilized just from standing there too long, getting lightheaded. So that's where good communication with your model is really important, and also working quick so you can get them in and out of the cast as fast as possible. So that's, again, one of those things where sometimes that might mean sacrificing some of the quality of the cast for your model's comfort. But Dani appreciates that we value her comfort over and her safety over other things. So, okay, so I'm ready to clean up my hands, and we're just about ready to demold. The plaster bandage cast here, this will set up to where we can demold that typically in about 10 minutes from the last bandage. Sometimes even faster than that, depending on your water temperature. That's another one of those things you want to be aware of. The warmer the water temperature, the faster the bandages go. In this kind of cast, when you want to get someone in and out, that's the best thing to do. Warm water to speed everything up. So keep your bandage water handy for cleaning your hands. Just a quick dip in there will clean your hands up really good. But be aware that if your plaster water goes down your drain, it will turn it solid, and that will be sad.
What do you do with your plaster water?
Funny you should ask, Dani. Thank you for that prompt. Once we're done with the plaster water, I usually just let that sit outside and evaporate. Once I've built up a fair amount it'll build up a lot of sediment in there. Let that dry up, and then I can just break it up and dump it in the dumpster and do it all over again. Or if you live out in the country, you can slowly build a caliche driveway.
Cool.
Now I'm just going to do a little test here just to see how this is setting up. And that is strong enough that it can demold there, but this is actually what's under the plaster bandage is actually going to be set up even more because of the heat that's being put off by the plaster bandage. If you are making silicone breasts for mastectomy patients and things like that, it does help to have those two molds separate of the left and right breast. And as you'll see later on, when we're casting these up, that allows us to treat each one as its own mold, and it's much easier to manage that cast. Now, if this was a different model where we wanted to accurately represent Dani's torso, then we would do those all together. But sometimes for those kind of casts where we're doing a very specific anatomical model, it really helps to isolate just that portion of the body and makes things that much easier. And don't run if you're not being chased. If we don't need to make an elaborate mold, then don't make one. When we're demolding this from Dani, we want to make sure we try to keep as much as possible, we want to try to keep that plaster bandage and silicone mold together. And the reason for that is if we take those off separate, not the end of the world, but we can have some misalignment. And especially while the silicone is still a little bit on the green side, that's where we could get some distortions in the mold. So real important when possible, it's not always practical to do it that way, but when you can do it, try your best to keep the silicone with the plaster bandage shell as you're removing it. And again, like Dani was saying, if you're, depending on the cast, we've done some torso casts where she takes a deep breath and the cast just comes right off. So, and you said you were feeling it releasing?
Mm-hmm, underneath.
Okay, so there's our mold. It's all done. We're going to trim out a little bit right down here, and this will be ready for casting, but we're just going to go in with scissors and clean up this outside edge. And other than that, this is ready to move on with the next step of the process. So thanks again, Dani.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was a good experience.
Okay, so we finished our life cast, and now we're ready to cast our silicone positive. Now, the reason I'm going to be using a silicone positive for this particular cast is a little bit of a shortcut. This is actually going to get us kind of a shortcut through making a clay or a plaster positive and refining that and then remolding that. In some cases, that may not be necessary. So we're going to treat this like this is that case, and we're just going to cast up a very simple silicone positive using the 0010 skin cast. And the idea here is we're just going to treat this mold like a kind of like a bowl and fill this up and tilt it just at the right angle so we can ideally fill this up as much as possible with our silicone, and that will give it a nice leveled back because that silicone will self-level, cure, and then we can peel that out. And I'm going to link at the end of this video to a couple of our other skin cast videos as well as one of our older tutorials that shows how to make that resin mold, because that's kind of a crucial step to taking this to the next level. But again, just understand this is the quick and dirty way to do this. Typically, if you're doing a much more refined professional production cast, I would recommend doing a plaster positive out of this or a clay positive, heated clay poured into this, taken out, resculpted, refined, and then molded. And so it all just depends on what your budget is for this project and how far you want to take it into that. So if there's enough interest in it, I'll do that in a future tutorial, but for now we're going to keep this pretty quick and dirty. So for now, we're just prepping this for casting our silicone positive. So first things first, we're just going to clean up the edge, just clip off the edge of the excess silicone. Now, there's our finished mold. Now, at this point, since I don't know the exact volume of this mold, there's a couple of ways we can figure that out. I've got several molds around here in the shop that I'm going to fill up with silicone. So I'm going to mix probably more than I need. But if you are on a tight budget and you want to make sure you're not over mixing your silicone, you can always determine the volume of the cast by filling this up with dry rice. Just get some plain dry rice, keep it in an airtight container, and use that to fill up your molds to determine that volume. And then pour that back out into a meter mixed, marked measuring cup, and you know exactly what your volume is. Now, once we've cast into that, we can weigh our cast and we know precisely how much we'll need each time. Okay, now obviously this mold does not stand up on its own, and we didn't want to have Dani standing still while we built little plaster bandage legs on this, so we're going to position this how we want it and prop it with some scrap pieces of foam. And we just want to make sure that's secure enough that when we go to pour this, it doesn't have to be super precise on exactly, perfectly level, because obviously this is an organic shape, so there's no part of Dani's torso that's a perfectly straight line. So we're just going to have to position this as close as we can get it, and we're going to fill it up so that this fills up kind of a puddle shape right here. It makes kind of a comma shape for a natural breast form. Now, the other thing we have to do to this mold before we pour our silicone in is it needs to be properly released. So for that, we're going to be using some of our Super Release PTR. And this is the release formerly known as Ejected 33. So we have it on our website both ways. So if you just search the number 33 or search Super Release, either way you're going to find it. But real important, when you see, just for the old timers like myself, I still have a picture of the old Ejected 33 can on the website, just so people know what it is, because a lot of people like me, they're still used to calling this Ejected 33. Now, this Super Release is an excellent way to keep silicone from sticking to silicone. But we want to make sure we get a thorough application, because if you were to miss any place, because this is a very dry silicone that doesn't have an oily residue or anything, and it really wants to bond to more silicone. So we want to make sure we spray it into the detail, spray it, and then brush it into the detail. And again, if you forget to do that, you'll sure find out, because most of the silicones, especially like the Plat-Seal gels, are very adhesive. So if you skimp on mold release, you will pay dearly. And in that undercut area, that's where I really have to be careful about missing a spot where you might get a bond. So any little wrinkles and folds and things like that in the mold, that's where you want to make sure you get a really good, thorough coverage. Brush it in all over and then allow that to dry. If we immediately pour our silicone while this release agent is still wet, we're going to wind up with a surface that might have some little pinhole bubbles from that release trying to evaporate into the silicone. So make sure you give it time to properly dry. Okay, now my workspace looks kind of crazy right now with the foam and the mold and such, but I've got my skin cast silicone ready to go, my gram scale, my mixing cup, my stir stick, and if you've been following along some of our recent tutorials, one of the little tricks I do with these really low viscosity silicone formulas is I'll take some of the silicone pigment, our flesh tone is just our general purpose flesh tone, it's kind of a medium flesh color, is a fairly thick paste, almost like frosting. So I'll take a little pea-sized glob of that, and then I'll stir in some silicone fluid to make more of a liquid out of it. And what that does is that makes it a little bit easier to go into suspension in these low viscosity systems, because because it's a very dense, thick pigment, when you put that in, it takes longer to get it really stirred in and suspended, and that wastes valuable mixing time. So little housekeeping trick that helps out a lot, and again, just minimizes how much mixing you have to do. And sometimes, depending on my project, I'll mix up maybe some custom colors like this as well. So now, I'm going to just guess at this because I've got several others that I poured up for previous videos, and I think this takes about 500 grams. So I'm going to do 250 of part A and 250 of part B. And as you've seen me do in previous videos, I always like to put the part that I've just poured up out of reach so I don't accidentally grab it twice. Okay, so we're ready to put our silicone pigment in, and we can actually pour this in now because it is that lower viscosity liquid. And this is a trivial amount of silicone fluid that we're adding to this, so we're not having to worry about that silicone fluid compromising the quality of our silicone here. But you see that just makes it so much easier to mix in. And we have a really nice color. Even though our color on this really doesn't matter, it just looks really strange, especially when you're going to be using that pattern for something else later on. It's harder to see the detail when you use just a colorless translucent silicone. So adding some pigment does help us see that a lot better. Sometimes you even want to add enough that it's opaque, depending on the application. And just remember, your measuring and your mixing are a key part of the process to making sure you get consistent results and you get a good uniform cure. One of the common things we see, especially with one-to-one systems like this, they're very easy to use, but also one-to-one does not mean sum to sum. You want to be as accurate as possible, and I really prefer to mix in grams. When I hear people mixing in ounces, I wince in agony, not because of communist conspiracy, but because it's just grams are just so much easier to work with than ounces. And you see that nice low viscosity. There's really no need to vacuum degas this. We can if we want, but this is a really low viscosity system. Now, that's just a little bit over 500 grams. We're going to tilt that back just a little bit. But that should give us a nice clean form to work with. Now, it's not perfectly filling that form, but that's okay. One of the benefits to this really soft system is this silicone, even if it's poured with a flat back like that, will conform when it's pressed up against the body. So it's real easy to work with on that front. So it allows us to cheat some of the normal things we would do to make sure we got a nice conforming part. It's a lot like a flat mold in that respect. So we're going to let that set. This has a working time of about 5 to 6 minutes at room temperature and a demold time of around an hour. And just remember, again, platinum system, so always be careful about contaminants and just make sure you're using clean mixing equipment, you're not wearing latex gloves, and remember that it can bond to other silicones, so always use the appropriate release to keep that from sticking. Okay, it's about an hour later and we're ready to demold our breast form. And you can see from here that I probably could have mixed up an extra, maybe 150, maybe even 200 grams to fill that up some more. But for our purposes today, that's plenty. One of the things I want to have ready when I'm doing a form like this is a flat board on which to place this form. And one of the reasons I'm using this particular formula of silicone rather than say gel 10 or gel 25 is it's inexpensive and it's very soft and it's kind of a throwaway material. So for this application, this is just going to be a transitional material to our resin mold. So we don't need this to be super strong. We just need this as kind of a placeholder to make our resin mold. This is where you want to be really careful because this is a more fragile silicone than the other Plat-Sil gels. You want to take care in demolding this. But there is our finished form. So now we have our form ready for our mold making process. And if you check the links at the end of this video, I'm going to have one of our older tutorials that explains that process of building a dam around this and making a reusable resin mold for this. So there you have the quick and dirty, as it were, process of taking a CopyCat Lifecast and then using that to create a silicone positive, and using that to then transition later to a resin negative mold, which of course we didn't cover here, but I'm going to put a link to that at the end of this video. So be sure to check out the other two videos. I'll link at the end screen for other skin cast silicone techniques, including using deadener. And as always, be sure to check the video description for all of the product links. Be sure to check out all the skin cast links and the deadener and all that. Everything we use in this tutorial will be linked in the video description. And of course, check out the video library, which I'll also link in our video description. Lots of good how-to resources there and much better organized than what we put on YouTube. So be sure to check that out. And thanks again for watching. I know this is a very long tutorial. A lot of you have requested some of these long form tutorials because there's a lot more detail to impart than I can cram into some of these shorter videos. So I appreciate your attention on this, and be sure to, of course, if you haven't already, like and subscribe and click the bell icon so you get notified when we put out new content.